context for this paper is the enormous changes that are currently taking place in the global political economy with the emergence of new developing country powers like China, India, and Brazil. These countries are challenging the longstanding dominance of the US and other advanced industrialized states in both the economic and the political realms. So on the one hand, as we all know, we've seen important structural changes in the global economy with a major shift in economic activity from the north to the south. And at the same time, this has also been accompanied by major shifts in the full range of institutions that are responsible for governing the global economy to try to give greater weight to these new powers. So we've seen this in the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, the climate change negotiations, and the WTO. So this transformation has been identified as one of the most important in modern history, and it raises a number of important questions about what agenda these countries are pursuing, what role they're playing in global economic governance, and also what impact this shift in power is ultimately having on multilateral cooperation and ultimately on the trajectory of neoliberal globalization. So extensive scholarship in sociology and political science has shown that economic globalization is not some kind of natural, self-propelled, inevitable force, but it's a project driven by specific agents, political struggles, and institutional changes. And this is something we talked a lot about yesterday, particularly during the discussion of Gavin's new book. So contrary to its own mythology, neoliberal globalization has involved not the removal of economic regulation, but actually the construction of new rules, regulations, and institutions to facilitate the spread and the deepening of global markets. So neoliberal globalization is thus as much a political as an economic process, requiring the restructuring and expansion of the global economic architecture in order to further the process of global economic integration. So neoliberal globalization is very much an institution-building process. And at the global level, institutions like the WTO have played a central role in this process. So we know that the existing institutions of global economic governance and this international economic order, including things like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, these were all created during and heavily shaped by the era of US hegemony. And the US has been a key driver of globalization and neoliberal economic restructuring. So the prospect of a shift away from US hegemony has therefore generated considerable debate about its potential consequences for global governance, multilateralism, and globalization. Given the very recent nature of this phenomenon, much of the existing work to date has been of a largely theoretical and speculative nature, basically trying to predict the consequences of these shifts. So different theories from international relations generate different predictions, with the primary divide centered on whether these shifts are likely to produce enhanced cooperation or ultimately result in conflict. So on the one hand, realist IR theory predicts that the emerging powers are likely to reject the rules, norms, and principles of the existing liberal economic order, and therefore pose a threat to multilateralism. Liberal institutionalism, on the other hand, envisions continued cooperation and a smooth integration of these new powers into the multilateral system. And lastly, from a critical perspective, inspired by world systems and dependency theory and neo-Marxism, there's been considerable speculation and debate about whether the rise of these new developing country powers could challenge neoliberal globalization and help usher in an alternative form of globalization and a more equitable and progressive global economic order. So the paper seeks to address these debates and contribute to our understanding of the nature and implications of contemporary power shifts through an examination of the case of the WTO. The WTO is a core institution in global governance, and it's a key site in the management of globalization and the construction of global neoliberalism. Not surprisingly, given its importance, the WTO has been a key site of struggle over global power relations. And it was one of the first significant international forums where we saw the rise of these new developing country powers. So I think the WTO provides a critical and very productive case to examine in order to understand the nature and implications of this transformation that's currently taking place. So in the paper, I analyzed the role that Brazil, India, and China have played at the WTO and assessed the impact that they've had on the multilateral trading system. Now, the WTO was intended to be a key pillar in the neoliberal restructuring of the global economy, driving trade and market liberalization around the world. But I argue that power shifts have resulted in multilateral disintegration and caused the neoliberal project to be brought to a halt at the WTO. The paradox, though, is that this is not because the new developing country powers have rejected the neoliberal paradigm, but rather the ideological embrace of global neoliberalism by the new powers has ultimately led to its institutional breakdown. So I construct this argument by drawing on 15 months of field research conducted primarily at the WTO in Geneva, as well as in Beijing, New Delhi, Sao Paulo, Brasilia, and Washington. And I draw on 3 sources of data: interviews, documentary analysis, and some direct observation, triangulating between these different sources. So the WTO, as I mentioned, is a core pillar in this institutional project of neoliberalism. It was created in 1995 as a successor to the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which had governed international trade since the end of World War II. The WTO was created at basically the height of the neoliberal euphoria that gripped policymakers in the 80s and 90s, and it was seen as ushering in a shift from embedded liberalism to neoliberalism. The WTO was intended to deepen and expand trade rules, and the new institution was given a powerful dispute settlement mechanism that dramatically enhanced its authority vis-a-vis states. So the creation of the WTO was thus a critical part of the effort to construct institutions at the global level that would facilitate the advance of neoliberal globalization. But the creation of the WTO was really only the first step in what was intended to be a much larger long-term project of neoliberal global restructuring. The multilateral trading system works through successive rounds of negotiations to progressively liberalize trade. So future rounds of trade negotiations were envisioned to fulfill the WTO's project of continually pushing forward the process of trade liberalization. So the creation of the WTO was not the realization of the neoliberal project in the realm of trade, but only its beginning. It was intended to lay the foundation for future liberalization to come. Now, for over half a century, the multilateral trading system has been dominated by the US and a small group of other advanced industrialized states. Agreements were typically negotiated amongst the so-called Quad, the US, EU, Canada, and Japan, and then imposed upon the rest of the organization's membership effectively as a fait accompli, while developing countries and their interests were severely marginalized. It was the US and the EU who drove the creation of the WTO and initiated its neoliberal project. And of course, they used substantial economic and political coercion to overcome resistance from developing countries. The first round of trade negotiations since the WTO was created, the Doha round, began in 2001. And like previous rounds, it was initially driven very strongly by the US and EU, who sought the continued process of expanding and deepening WTO rules. And at the start of the round, these two, the US and the EU, were very firmly in the driver's seat. However, over the course of the Doha round, a significant transformation has taken place at the WTO. In 2003, this old Quad, which had constituted the elite inner circle of power at the WTO for decades, vanished, replaced instead by a core negotiating group centered on the US, EU, Brazil, and India. And in 2008, they were also joined by China. So essentially, Canada and Japan got the boot from this elite inner circle and were replaced by these 3 developing countries. So I don't have the time to go into this in detail here, but in the paper I demonstrate how these new powers, Brazil, India, and China, have had a profound impact on the WTO. They clearly are showing an increase in power. They've had a dramatic impact on the dynamic and the agenda of the Doha round. They've had a considerable impact on specific issues under negotiation, and they've also become major users of the WTO dispute settlement process. And all of these they've been using to challenge the trade policies of the traditional powers. So what I argue is that although these new powers have challenged the traditional workings of the WTO, their opposition has been to the dominance of the US and other advanced industrialized countries, not to the fundamental norms and principles of the institution or to the neoliberal ideology that animates it. So in other words, theirs is a power challenge, not an ideological one. The new powers are challenging the hegemony of the US, but not the fundamental rules of the liberal international order. As their booming exports attest, these countries have been among the primary beneficiaries from liberalization of the global economy. The neoliberal turn in the global political economy and the free trade policies adopted by many countries in recent decades have opened markets for their exports and fueled their economic expansion. So although Brazil, India, and China all employ rhetoric that's strongly reminiscent of the era of third worldism in the 60s and 70s and its call for a radical overhaul of the international economic order, the agendas they're actually pursuing at the WTO fit solidly within, rather than challenge, the liberal trade paradigm. Rather than rejecting the rules, norms, and principles of the liberal trading system, the new developing country powers have embraced them, seeking to work with the rules and use them to their advantage. So in effect, they've turned the WTO system against its originators, demanding further market liberalizing reforms from the US and other rich countries. And this is a profound transformation of the WTO. Basically, for all 8 previous trade rounds, it was the US who was the key aggressor and the driver of liberalization at the WTO, pushing other countries to open their markets while maintaining protections in sensitive areas of its own. But now, specifically by going after the US and other northern states on the issue of agriculture subsidies, which has been, I would say, the pivotal issue in the Doha Round negotiations, by going on the offensive on this issue, the new developing country powers for the first time have seized the offensive and made the protectionist policies of the US a central target at the WTO. So the situation we now have at the WTO is one in which the traditional powers, the US and EU, are faced off against the new developing country powers, Brazil, India, and China. Each side is demanding additional liberalization from the other, but refusing to yield itself. And with these two sides relatively evenly matched, neither has been able to overpower the other and impose its preferences. So the conflict between the old and new powers has been the defining feature of the round, and the outcome has been repeated stalemate and breakdown. The old and new powers have simply been unable to reach agreement, and with the negotiations at an impasse, the Doha round has now effectively collapsed. So what I argue is that in a situation of more equitable power relations among states, multilateralism, the ability of states to cooperate to construct international laws, rules, and institutions, has disintegrated. The emergence of competing powers to counterbalance the traditional dominance of the US has now brought the Doha round to a standstill. Now, the necessity of perpetual progress in expanding and deepening liberalization is among the fundamental organizing principles of the multilateral trading system, with WTO negotiators and officials frequently drawing analogy to a bicycle that must be continually moving forward lest it topple over. As I mentioned earlier, the WTO was created to continually push forward trade and market liberalization and neoliberal structuring through these successive rounds of negotiations. But what we see is that the emergence of competing powers to counterbalance the traditional dominance of the US has disrupted this project. It now looks like it will be impossible to conclude the Doha round, and even if negotiators do manage to salvage some kind of conclusion to the round, it will be a dramatically watered-down version of what was originally intended. So in a context of greater equality among states, we see that states are unable to cooperate to pursue the continued progress of trade liberalization multilaterally through the WTO. So power shifts have caused this institutional project of neoliberalism, the construction and expansion of rules and institutions to further the advance of globalization and neoliberal market restructuring, to be brought to a halt at the WTO. The new balance of power in the global political economy has therefore disrupted the construction of these new multilateral rules to further the process of neoliberal globalization. I'm just finishing up. So paradoxically, I conclude the ideological embrace of global neoliberalism by these new powers has ultimately led to its institutional breakdown. And what was supposed to be the start of the neoliberal project in the realm of trade, the Uruguay round that created the WTO, may in fact have become its apex. So I'll conclude there.